Good morning. I'm Claudia Schwartz, welcoming you to our June 2023 UCSD HR Leadership event. By participating today, you will earn 1 hour of credit towards your PHR and SHRM certifications. You'll also receive a recording of our session and a copy of the materials that we'll be learning today. And now it is such a pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Jathan Janove. And Jathan requires no introduction, absolutely. Of course, we had over 100 participants signing up today because, Jathan, we know you from so many different sources, the contributions that you make to the HR community, one as an author of 4 books, and also writing the SHRM column. You have over 112 articles in the SHRM column, and actually the subject today is displayed in one of the articles that you can access, and we're going to give you a link in a moment. And Jathan, you're going to be speaking actually at the SHRM conference next week, right? And signing books. So if you're going to the conference, you can see Jathan in person there. And so much that you do, and you're also one of our faculty members, instructors at UCSD Extension in the HR certificate program. And we're just discussing the title of your course. So path from to CHRO, or the bottom line is, well, we'll learn more about the learning that you offer in your course. And today, our focus is 3 tools to avoid workplace claims. So let me display the slide in just a moment. And then Jathan, you can jump right in. So one moment, please. Can everyone see the slide? Okay, so Jathan, tell me when you're ready to advance to the different steps. And then please, everyone, submit your questions and comments through either the chat or the Q&A functions in your Zoom, because we really want to hear from you. We can answer some questions during the program. Others will save for the end, but definitely interactive. Jathan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here. Hi, folks. I thought it might be helpful before getting into what these 3 tools are to get a little, maybe a snapshot of my background. My workplace perspective actually began in high school. My father was a university professor involved in the early stages of what is now known as the organization development field. Essentially, how to build organizational trust, collaboration, good communication, so on. And he dragged me to some of his programs. So I had an early introduction to the OD world way back when. But then I went to law school. Heck with that. Why bother with trust or collaboration? That's not good for the billable hour, right? But I became a labor and employment law attorney. So essentially, I sort of stayed in the workplace relationship arena. And essentially what I made a living on was toxic workplace relationships that might have begun win-win, and then they ended up toxic lose-lose and in the US legal system. And so I practiced labor and employment law for about 25 years, had clients all over the country, and that was my field. But as time went by, I started to see these patterns and how unnecessary it is. And it started to harken me back to some of the things that my father was talking about as a professor on organization development in the 1970s. So I started to kind of, mush the 2 together. And then finally, at one point I said, I can't really be, fish or fowl. So I left the law behind. So I can say I'm no longer a practicing attorney. In fact, I'm no longer, I guess you'd call me a recovering lawyer, whatever you want to call me. Obviously, though, those 25 years and all those stories and experiences inform everything I do today. But my work today is really as a consultant and a coach, focusing on leadership and workplace culture. And that's essentially what I'm about. So Claudia, should we just get going? And you'll
Yes,
monitor the chat,
absolutely.
and I'm happy to be interrupted, Claudia. So, if people have questions, and otherwise we're going to allow time at, toward the end as well. I mean, if you are going to the SHRM conference next week in Vegas, it'd be great to see you. So there's 3 tools. First one is wait forward on skis. And that probably sounds strange to you, but that's okay. So where did this come from? Well, I grew up in the Midwest, amidst cornfields. And then I decided, go west, young man. I moved to Utah. And I practiced law there for a while. And I was also working in other states too. Well, what I did is when I got there, the lawyers in my firm said, you need to learn how to ski. And you're reasonably athletic, you'll catch on. Well, side note, if you want to learn how to ski, don't have lawyers teach you. Because instead of taking me to the bunny hill, they took me up to the top of, if any of your skiers, Snowbird, up to the tram, all the way up 3,000 vertical feet. And down I went. Down I went, clothing, material, skis, body parts, whatever. But I learned how to ski. And years later, as I was reflecting on what goes wrong in the workplace, why do employers, including HR professionals, unintendedly, unwittingly create billable hours? And it struck me that there was an exact analogy to skiers. And I know a lot of you snowboarders, and maybe you can advise me if it's different. But here's the thing. I'll start with the skiing and then I'll take it into the workplace. When you learn how to ski, it's intimidating, right? You're looking down the downhill slope and you're worried about going too fast, out of control, and crashing. So there's a natural, intuitive instinct that says counterbalance downhill momentum with uphill momentum. Now, what happens if you ski that way? Bad things. So what do instructors tell you? It's completely counterintuitive. They tell you to put your weight forward on your skis, your weight toward the danger. And that's the only way you can ski effectively. And it struck me this is an exact parallel, because in every one of these cases that I took, and confession, I started as a plaintiff's attorney. And then depending on your point of view, I saw the light or was drawn to the dark side. I was a defense attorney. But in either case, every one of these lawsuits, including class actions where millions of dollars were spent, were all rooted in avoidance. They were all rooted in managers, executives, sometimes HR professionals saying, ooh, this could be a problem. Let's give it time. Let's give it space. Let's give it distance. Avoidance. And that, more than anything else in my experience, is why we have such a robust employment law profession. It's that instinct to avoid. Now, it's probably, if you're a Darwinist, back in the old days, if you were in a cave and you heard something rustle outside your cave and your first thought is, I'm hungry. This could be food for me and my family. And your second thought was, ooh, I could be food for it, right? So you learn to err on the side of caution, err on the side of pessimism or skepticism, err on the side of avoidance, because after all, back in those days, it's probably better to miss a meal than be a meal. Okay, but you fast forward 50,000 years, 100,000 years, it's the opposite in the workplace. Okay, that conversation that makes you anxious and you avoid it is the conversation that you should be having first. So what I say is, there is that avoidance instinct does have a value. It's as a trigger to do the very opposite of what that instinct is telling you. That potential gnarly situation that's causing anxiety should be, instead of the thing to avoid, first on your agenda. What's my plan? And by the way, for your HR professionals on this, it's also a great way to connect and bond with your managers. Because, see, to me, the best value of HR isn't the legal compliance. It's having a resource, having someone to speak with. Past life, I managed the Portland and Seattle offices of a huge international law firm. And I remember the first time I had an issue with one of the attorneys, and I called the head of HR in a different office as the home office. And she said, "Why are you calling me? You're the expert." And I said, "It's because of the Solomon paradox." Okay. Anybody know the Solomon paradox? So basically, King Solomon, right? The wise king. Well, when it came to his personal decisions, they were disasters. So University of Chicago researchers discovered that when they presented research subjects with challenging human situations, and then they presented them a separate study where they're advising a friend with the identical situation, guess what? If it's your situation and you're facing it, you don't gather as much information, you don't identify as many options, you're much more rigid in your thinking. Then you would advise a friend that you care about. You don't do what you would say to a friend you care about. And so what I explained was, I'm dealing with this right now. I need another voice. I need something to bounce off of. And it isn't a matter of staying out of court. It's a matter of how do I manage this challenging human relationship? And that's where I see a huge upside for the HR profession in this space is don't wait until we're talking about trying to fire somebody. If things are not going quite well, talk to me. So I'll pause here because that's the first point. And then if there's any questions, otherwise I'll roll into tool number 2.
We can roll into tool number 2. In the meantime, please submit your questions.
Okay. The no fear. Now, Claudia, I didn't catch this. I used to call it the no fear confrontation. I call it the no fear conversation now. Okay. Because really, it's a conversation. So, what is it? Well, those of you who read my column, and I'll start with that. In fact, why don't you pop the other 2 up there, the A and the R. Okay. Those of you who've worked with me or read my stuff, you know that I've been preaching and talking about using your ear. In other words, shifting from telling to listening, from a telling mode to listening mode. And you'll see that in many of my articles. So the ear, EAR, we'll start with that, is open-ended questions first. In other words, you're approaching a conversation from a curiosity paradigm. What's going on with the other person? I want to understand the other person. So those are open-ended questions. The acknowledge is not that they acknowledge that they understand, that you are understood. It's that you understand them. That's the key. And then and only then do you respond. So it's a sequence. Human nature is respond, 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 respond. I know that as a coach. I've watched it, and even people that said, "Oh, I'm going to do this ear thing." And I'll say, "Oh, good, let me observe you." And then it was like, dude, all I heard were R's. Okay, I heard maybe occasionally, but it was pretty much R. That's our wiring, especially if we're in a position of authority. So I do at all levels talk about, using your ear, explore, acknowledge, respond. Now, I'm going to apply this in those potential claim scenarios. Okay. And I was just actually doing that with a client in San Jose yesterday. And basically you add one element to it. That's the F, or frame. Meaning before you go into active listening mode, which you will, you frame what the conversation will be about. Now, the frame is not the picture, it's the frame. It sets the structure. So essentially what you do, and when I coach people on this, I'll actually have them write out what that frame is, and then what their first opening question is. Example, And we can apply it all over. And people want to say, well, how would you do it here, there, the other? That's what I do on a daily basis. I'll take a simple example. Okay, you hire an hourly worker whose shift begins at 8. The worker shows up at 8:10. Okay. No fear conversation. Jim, it's 8:10. Your shift begins at 8. That's the frame. Now you go into active listening, curiosity, learning mode. So what do? You don't say, what the hell's the matter with you? That's suggesting a position, right? You don't say, why are you late? That's a conclusion. You ask a pure open-ended question. What happened? And then you go into active listening mode. Now, some of you may say, well, that's a simple, easy thing. Well, trust me, I don't get hired for the simple, easy things. I get hired for the nasty, gnarly ones. I'm just giving you an illustration. And if you think you can stump me with it, please do. Okay. But that's the essence of the no fear conversation. And the reason I also like not just the acronym is the people that I've coached that have converted this into their habits, their leadership habits. They never go back to what they've done. And what they tell me is conversations that they would have feared, they no longer fear. That's the beauty of it. So that's the no fear confrontation. So, questions to this point, or should we roll to the third and last and see what people have to say?
Yes, so we can roll. And again, remember that if you submit a question, it is private. So Jathan and I will see it, but other participants will not. So we understand the subject is delicate if you're talking about relationships in the workplace, but we don't have to identify your name or your company. We can just read the question. And if it is the kind of situation that applies to everyone, we can all learn from your question. So please send it in privately.
Great.
All right. So next step.
Okay. Same day summary. Now, this should get some attention from our HR professionals, especially those in the golden state of California, golden state for lawyers. It's interesting because I had national clients back in my day. And, we have maybe, 550 employees in Maine and 270 employees in Alabama, 150 in Utah, and maybe 12 in California. So when I get a call from the HR director, Jathan, I need your help. Guess what? More often than not, it was one of the 12. Okay, so I get it. Okay, if that's your world, is the golden state for lawyers, behind every employee is a plaintiff's attorney, etc. I get it. So this will probably seem like really radical stuff, and maybe that'll open up some questions. So actually, why don't you put the other elements up there, Claudia?
Sure.
And I'll walk through them. Okay, and we'll go through this. So what is the same day summary? Okay, this was based on years of frustration as a defense attorney, especially. As a plaintiff's attorney, I love to get the documents. Okay, as a defense attorney, they made me cringe. Either there wasn't a document when there needed to be one, or I wish the document that existed didn't exist. Okay, think of the later Fox News case. So what I found was that all this preventative medicine, a lot of it originated in California, was, if anything, backfiring. Okay, because it didn't take into account human reality and the workplace reality. And people weren't going to, as a lawyer, I could tell you what the perfect document is as a defense lawyer, but that just wasn't reality. And more often than not, it worked the other way. Well, in fact, there was an article published by SHRM years ago. It was very interesting. It was talking about the performance review. And a California attorney looked for decisions where performance reviews had showed up as a material fact. And she found 40 state and federal California cases. And then she looked at, who was citing the performance review. Was it the plaintiffs? Was it the defendants? Well, guess what? The proportion was. Guess what the ratio was? Guess what? Okay, there were 40 of them. 39. The plaintiff was using the performance review. Only once was the defendant citing it. And this was the management tool, and this was the HR tool. So realizing that and recognizing human reality, I threw out all of my, conservative abundance of caution lawyering and said, what is a document that a manager could actually write that would be helpful? Not perfect, but helpful. And this is it. So let's walk through it. Same day summary. It's written after. After is a key word. In other words, you don't hand them their disciplinary, fourth verbal or whatever. No, you have a real-time conversation with the person about whatever the issue is. And it's written ASAP. In fact, if I were to change the term, I'd probably call it same hour summary. Sooner you do it, the better. Okay. A guy named Ebbinghaus, a century or two ago, did a study on memories, and basically were sieves. After 2 hours, it just starts to leak. So the sooner you do it, the better. And you let them know, I'm going to send you this little short summary, stay on the same page. So there it is, point two from, email is a great tool. And then you briefly, okay, see the highlighted word, summarize only what you think are significant takeaways. Okay. Now, it's what you think needs to be preserved and conveyed in writing. So in other words, it's not a true summary like you're taking meeting minutes. It's a strategic document. What do I think, based on this conversation I just had, needs to be preserved and communicated in writing? Okay. Now, what allows you to get away with that? It's the last point. If I missed anything or misstated anything, let me know. You put the ball in their court. And that's it. And when I've worked with people, they can bang these things out in minutes. Now, I bet a whole bunch of folks are noticing there's something missing. What's missing? And maybe we'll get into this in the Q&A. Signature. There's no sign off from management. There's no sign off from HR. There's no sign off from the employee. Oh my gosh, this is reckless. Well, let's get into it. Frame your question. But I can tell you, I've been teaching, preaching, practicing, coaching this for over 20 years. And I can, in any way, shape, or form, you want to measure it. All right. This completely eclipses, in terms of effectiveness, conventional HR documentation, especially when we're talking about disciplinary matters. So,
yes.
in conclusion, this is it. You commit to these three things, and not only, okay, are you going to protect your company, you're going to help build a healthier culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Jathan, and maybe you saw one of the questions, which was exactly, can you prove, if ever contested, how do you prove the employee received the same day summary if a signature is not required?
You make it a regular practice. You coordinate with HR to preserve them. And maybe in 20 years, it's a common question, but maybe in 20 years, that's come up once. So if it's your regular practice and you explain it, okay, and you preserve it, plus if you're talking about progressive discipline, kind of a contradiction in terms in my view, but you refer back to the previous same-day summary. So there's all sorts of ways to essentially minimize, if not eliminate, the risk of saying I never got it. Okay, especially go back to wait for it on skis. If you're dealing with this early on, and then they say, well, I don't recall seeing it. Well, you've got another issue to deal with. So point is, that is a common question or concern, I can say empirically speaking, if you make it a consistent practice, okay, and you communicate it, and you preserve these documents as a regular practice, okay, the likelihood that that will become a problem is, I won't say it's nil, but it's a lot closer to nil than real. Again, I'm speaking empirically.
Mhm. In another way to view it is you could ask for some kind of response, what are your thoughts? And can you please let me know that you got this? But then you may not really receive an answer. So what are the pros and cons?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't recommend that, Claudia. Because the thing is, you want something that's user-friendly for the person writing it. But if I put in there, what are your thoughts? Or please acknowledge, it's not as user-friendly. Plus, it puts more pressure on the recipient, you see. If I'm the recipient of this, let me use the example before. Okay, so I come in late. All right, you say, Jathan, it's 8:10, we need you here at 8, that's your shift. Sorry, I blah, 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 and I'm gonna commit to being here on time. Great, wonderful, just keep us on the same page, I'll send you a short summary. All right, well, it's fresh. To Jathan from Claudia, today's date, etc. Just a quick summary, we talked about, when you came in at 8:10, we need you here at 8, and I appreciate the fact that you committed to being here every day at 8 o'clock. How long does it take to write that? You don't say, what do you think? You don't say, sign this, okay? Because otherwise it becomes a challenge for you, and then it also builds in a place for error and mistake. Going back to what I said about that study, 39-to-1, management's document being used against it, okay? So no, I'm not going to say, what do you think? I'm not going to require them to respond. Okay, I'll preserve it, but it's balls in their court. Let me know if I missed anything or misstated anything. Okay, quick, easy, user-friendly.
Yes.
For the writer.
Yes.
And I coach this in every kind of context you could imagine. Okay, not just in this space.
Yes, and it could be with an executive or someone who just started at a company. Another question was, could you please further explain number 2? I imagine maybe what you meant, it's an anonymous question. So from to date of same day summary and date of meeting or discussion. So anything to add there? So it's usually an email, right? So the email is going to show from who is sending from, as you mentioned, let's say from Jathan to Claudia, the date of the same day summary, that's the date of the email, let's say, and then the date of the meeting or discussion, which might be the same day or maybe one day or so earlier.
Well, or later, yeah, but yeah. So, from Claudia to Jathan, to today's date, got a ray line, you can say attendance. Jathan, here's a quick recap. Let me know if I missed or misstated anything. After we discussed about you coming in at 8:10 today and the necessity to be here at 8, you said, that you now fully understood and were committed to being here every day on time. Okay, boom, done.
Yes. Thank you, Jathan. Another request or question was, can you provide a sample same-day summary when you send the slide?
Uh-huh.
Do you have a sample to share with us?
I've got many. I'm not a very computer, like that would mean like a share screen dump, and then I've got that's a good suggestion. I don't know, maybe we'll have to do a second round. Because for me to now, and then I probably also have to change some names for, client confidentiality, but sure, I could give you dozens of examples. I'm not equipped to give them now. Sorry.
Another question was kind of back to the no fear conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The question was, to get to the no fear conversation, one must consider the conditions that foster fear-ridden environments. What has been your experience in organizations immersed in fear? And what has been your advice as to where one starts?
Boy. There are organizations that are immersed in fear of consequences, which I just think is absolutely the wrong way to address accountability. I hate to use the old, annoying lawyer answer, since I'm not a lawyer anymore, but it depends. So for instance, I'm working with a company right now where they did a survey, and what came out of it was an unhealthy culture, and there was some fear. And there were some tangible correlative factors such as retention. Okay. So the CEO wasn't aware of this, and it wasn't necessarily his behavior, said we need to do something about this. So I guess if you're in an organization where fear is an element of the culture, I'd start with the CEO and not assume that that's what the CEO wants. Unfortunately, sometimes they do. But it used to be that when I'd get hired to do stuff, it was like the CEO or the C-suite saying to HR, go throw something at this. Go throw something at DEI. Go throw something at culture. And, I've gotten to a point now where I say, are you serious? Because if that's your approach, it isn't going to happen. Okay. The driver in chief is not HR, it's the CEO. And the C-suite has to be supporting it fully, not just in theory, but in practice. So, that's a complicated, challenging issue where you have a culture where there's a lot of fear. But what I can tell you is from experience is a lot of times the top leadership is just not aware of it. And if aware of it, and if there's some correlatives in terms of, injuries or turnover or so forth, if you can fire up your CEO to attack that, amazing things will happen. I would encourage you to read the story of Doug Conant and Campbell Soup. Amazing things will happen. In my view, though, it isn't sufficient to get HR on board. You've got to get your CEO on board. Yes. If you're really serious about organization culture.
And naturally, the CEO may be a key source of the fear. And I'm thinking of an example where the VP of HR, CHRO, was actually in a life science company, and the CEO was the source of the issues. And the HR leader actually very objectively quantified the impact of the fear, particularly in a life sciences environment, right? You're running all the parallel tracks and research and clinical trial. And basically, after talking to the CEO so many times with very negative results, she actually went to the board and had a discussion with the board. And the board saw the quantitative analysis and saw basically how much money the fear was costing the organization, delaying the research and progress and impacting, the potential stock price later. And they dealt with the situation with the CEO. So that is unusual in HR. And I think it worked particularly because she had attempted so many different no fear conversations with the CEO himself, but it hadn't worked. And then she went up to the board. So how often do we do that in HR? Fortunately, not often. I think more often we self-select out and we seek another organization to be associated with. But yes, it is an option to keep on going up towards higher levels of leadership where fear is not really coming up.
Yeah, well, and to your point, Claudia, I've had senior HR professionals, asking me about how do I deal with this exact situation. And my first question is what's your BATNA? Okay, that should be like a prize. Anybody know BATNA? It's from a book that was written a long time ago, but people still cite it. Getting the yes? Anybody remember getting the yes? So what's BATNA? BATNA? Anybody? Okay, never mind. All right. Put it in the chat if you know. And Claudia will send you a piece of swag or something. So BATNA is best alternative to negotiated agreement. So when an senior HR person has said, I've got this problem, and I don't think my CEO is supportive, and I think if I'm really honest and candid, I might be in the crosshairs. So what I say is, all right, let's just take a worst case scenario and you confront the CEO about this issue. What happens if he says or she says your services are no longer needed? And so that's what I do, is to kind of prep them on this, to go in there with it. Now, another aspect of this is I've been brought in, actually, I've got a couple of current engagements where it did go to the board, and the board did say, you can't remain in this position as the CEO with this kind of culture. And in some cases, the CEO is like, well, then buy me out. But in a lot of cases I've seen, and that's why I say there's always hope, is the CEO had a blind spot. They didn't realize how big a jerk they were. And they didn't realize that their jerkish behavior was actually contrary to their fundamental goals and desires, which really are based on a highly engaged workforce. And again, I'd invite you to look at the history of Doug Conan and Campbell Soup as a case study.
Yeah, and that's where talking about Marshall Goldsmith and the stakeholder-centered coaching, that kind of process of getting the input from key stakeholders and having the awareness be raised, and then the coaching be very targeted towards that behavioral change, sometimes it works well, right? So can I read another question, which is a little bit unique, but the question goes like this. Most conflicts have undercurrents, meaning deeper issues going on. How would you recommend managing a conflict with a senior leader who admitted that her reaction was triggered by a deep-rooted personal issue, in that case being domestic violence? It doesn't excuse her behavior, but it's also confidential information that should not be shared with the employee.
I probably have some follow-up questions before I would advise. So maybe let me see what I can say based on what you've shared. I do a lot of conflict intervention work. And when I do it, I say to the parties, and this is where, trust is broken down and so forth. There's 3 rules. Okay. Candor, civility, and active listening, which is the ear, the EAR. And that's what I'd recommend. If you're trying to intervene or mediate or facilitate a problematic relationship, which I think is a great way value. And by the way, pretty much everything I've said, if you go to that link, my author page with Sherm, and you scroll down and you'll find an article. It's okay. But it's what I find is that most of these terrible conflicts or terrible relationships, they're rooted in a foundation of assumptions about each other that are largely erroneous and negative and reinforcing to the other. So as a facilitator, intervener, whatever you want to call it, is I want to expose those assumptions with them. Okay. And so, if the person wants to follow up with me directly, because there are some nuanced questions I'd ask, but that's what I would say to the folks on this program is, if you're trying to mediate a conflict of others, 3 rules. Okay. That's it. Civility, candor. Okay. No elephant in the room left unaddressed, and active listening, so that we're not making assumptions. Instead, we're getting them to acknowledge that we understand them. And that's my take on workplace conflict.
Mhm. Yes, thank you. Going back to the same day summary, Jathan, the question is, for discussions that HR serves as a neutral party between an employee and the employee's manager, what would you suggest? That HR writes up the same day summary, or be the sender or the manager, or in this question, our participant asked, or does HR just write the same day summary for preservation? So, talk us about the role of HR and manager.
Yeah, well, typically what I do in the training work and the coaching work is I train and coach the managers to write the same day summary. However, I also train and coach the HR professionals to serve as coaches for those managers on their same day summaries. Okay. Which is what I do, myself. So the manager has the meeting. Sometimes HR is present and sometimes they're not. Now, if HR is present, HR could write the same day summary. But let's just say, again, we'll take the simple example. Manager's been trained on the same day summary. Employee comes in at 8:10. Does the no fear confrontation, says, just keep us on the same page. Well, I'm going to suggest that manager run it quickly by HR before sending it to the employee, until essentially where the HR person has confidence. Because what I found with same day summaries is people that say, oh yes, I'm going to do this, I'm in. It's simple, but it isn't necessarily easy. And it takes a couple of iterations before people start to really get it down. So I always look at, if I'm working with a company, I look at the HR folks as kind of, if I'm the coach, they're the assistant coaches. So that's how I see, and from an overall philosophy standpoint, that's how I see the HR profession. as a coach that's promoting a healthy culture, which, among other benefits, is going to keep you out of court, based on my former profession.
You were evolved from employment attorney to coach and consultant, right?
Yeah, well, my father is no longer around, but I think if he was, I think he'd get a kick out of my own evolution. And I'm
Yes, well,
sure,
there's
and he had a kind of edgy sense of humor, so I'm sure I'd get a couple of insults winged my way for how long it took me.
yeah. So, and naturally, in your case, that choice was wise. It's so refreshing because now I've been in HR for over 40 years to see how, for each decade, how so many employment attorneys have continued to be employment attorneys and evolved in the same direction that you have, Jathan, towards the constructive, proactive coaching, really focused on the human relationships and building better cultures in the workplace. So yes, it's possible to remain as an employment attorney and also incorporate that. And we have quite a few excellent ones in San Diego. So, that's a good thing to see.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another question. Since we're talking about the same day summary, so our participant asked, so if I am understanding correctly, you were advising us not to use the delivery, read, and receipt function in programs like Outlook to confirm receipt of the same day summary?
Correct, unless. Correct, unless it's like the universal, and this would be some deviation. But yeah, the concept is, if I'm writing this thing, I write it summarizing what I think are the key takeaways. And by the way, just on that point, something else occurs to you. Oh, I forgot to. What do? If it's at all significant, what do? Throw it in the same day summary? No. You go back. So for instance, if I say, and I'm going to do a review in 30 days, okay, I communicate that real time. So there's no surprises in the same day summary. So the idea is I want it as user-friendly as possible for the person writing it. Okay. So unless that, I know this come up before, I certainly wouldn't make an exception to do that with same day summaries. I just send them out, preserve them. Also, if you notice, you don't just send it to them, you tell them you're going to send it to them. Do you see that with number one? It's very important. The document itself should not be a surprise, whatever it says. Okay, whatever it says.
So the no surprise rule applies. No. So here's another question and comment. You mentioned the frequency that reviews are cited for defendants. However, in a termination action, the traditional approach is documentation around progressive discipline.
Right.
Are you suggesting same-day summaries should replace, quote unquote, progressive discipline documentation?
Yes. And I say that empirically, not theoretically. I know this may look like blonde hair to you, but it's really not.
Yes. And even the term progressive discipline, right? So progressive discipline,
there's no such thing,
clashes with at-will employment. So, in most organizations, we avoid that term, but we hear what you're saying, that in litigation, very often, there is an expectation that it's proven somehow in writing that the issues were communicated, that the team member was given an opportunity to understand and respond and improve and meet expectations, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And what you're saying, Jathan, is that the same day summary meets that purpose
Takes care of
adequately
it.
or more.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been, this is my first rodeo, and same-day summaries have shown up in administrative proceedings and occasionally in court. Not that often, and I'm proud of that. Not that often, and I'm proud of that. Because the best claim is when you prevent it.
Hmm.
But when some of my larger clients have had to rely on these things in EEOC or, wrongful discharge, whatever, their feedback has been, it was very useful and was very credible. Because it didn't appear to the judge or the jury or the investigator or the arbitrator as something that was manufactured by HR to document some adverse employment action. It looked like real communication. And that's a lot more credible.
Mhm. And so you also talk a lot about replacing the traditional performance reviews, and you have written about it. And actually, you have a webinar coming up with SHRM, right, on replacing the traditional quote unquote performance reviews. So tell us about the integration of same day summaries and the less traditional reviews.
Okay, well, very simply, and maybe that's a subject for another session. My recommended approach to performance reviews consists of three things. And you'll see I've written about it. One is what I call the star profile. This is where the manager expresses in as few words as possible what he or she thinks is success in actual behavior performance in the job. Okay. And I have lots of examples of that. So you do a star profile. Then when it's review time, and my default is every 90 days. And separated from pay and all that stuff. Daniel Pink talks about that too in his books. You reflect on how the person has done with those, 1, 2, 3, 4 characteristics. And you share it in the spirit of a no fear conversation. Meaning okay, let's say, Claudia, this was back in my managing attorney days. And you're an associate attorney, which is, the younger attorneys that support the partners. Okay. And when I did that, I had a 3-sentence star profile for a star associate attorney. And so what we do is I'd start by saying, Claudia, here's my take on the first characteristic, which is first-rate legal work. And then I do it briefly, and then we go into a discussion. What are your thoughts? How do you see it? And then the second characteristic, which was zealous responsiveness to internal and external clients, we talk about that. What does that mean, and how have you done? And then the third was treats everyone with respect at all times. Of course, includes staff and all, pressures, etc. So I would use those as hooks to say, here's what I've observed in the last 90 days. What do you think? And then there'd be a same day summary after that captures what I think are the key components of our discussion about how you've done in the past 90 days. That's how I'd recommend doing it. And that's what when I'm, coaching and so forth, that's what I coach.
Yes, thank you. So here's another question. The participant said she or he has a global HR management team and thinks that your presentation is very valuable, simple, and back to the basics. Which one of your books would you recommend for the team to read to learn more about how to avoid workplace claims?
Well, thank you for that. And let me actually say something. Everything I've developed, okay, is simple. I've worked at that. But I also say simple doesn't mean easy. Okay. So don't assume, okay, wait for it, okay. That's the coaching world. So yes, it's simple by design, but don't assume it's easy. That's the first thing. Second point is, I would say probably the book I'd recommend is, and you can get it on Amazon, it's Hard-Won Wisdom, True Stories from the Management Trenches. And it's kind of like an Aesop's Fables. I basically take real situations that I've dealt with. I change names and circumstances for obviously privacy reasons. So I share the story and then I do the analysis, and then I bring the tools into the analysis, what if kind of thing. So that's what I'd recommend. Hard-Won Wisdom, True Stories from the Management Trenches. And yes, and I agree. And I appreciate you saying, I've made it simple, but just don't conflate that with easy. I mean, I think simple is maybe a path, but it takes work. Because if you can probably tell from the questions, so much of what I'm sharing is counterintuitive. So you have to be able to get through that, like leaning back on skis versus weight forward.
Absolutely. And tell us about your 3 other books and your SHRM column.
Well, the other books are, one was the first book I wrote, actually SHRM co-published it, which was a kind of managing static court, kind of the original thing. It's sort of, in a way, if some of you read the Covey 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I mean, it's not a ripoff on it, but it's a sort of influenced by. In fact, Covey himself put a nice little blurb in there. And then I did a book on just the star profile itself. Okay. Then there's the Hard-Won Wisdom. And then the 4th book, this was one that was unpublished, was for a late friend of mine who was an amazing human being. And I just felt he needed to be remembered. So I wrote a kind of self-published book on him, which, if you're interested, you can find on my website on the media, because there's a PDF of it. Bert Spiegel, incredible human being. I mean, there's just some amazing human beings on this planet, and and they should be celebrated.
Absolutely. So I know we're coming up to the hour here in a minute. If you have a last question, please submit. But otherwise, we're just getting more comments than questions and compliments to you, Jathan, such as, yes, 100% agree. Simple is not easy. Yes. So the implementation is the trick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jathan, we thank you so much for being with us this morning, and we'll see you next week at the SHRM conference. And really, your perspective on things is much appreciated. It's different, it's very actionable, and that's what we need more of. So thank you so much.
Oh, very welcome. Happy to do it.
And thanks everyone for participating, and we'll send you the invitation for the next event soon. Thank you.